But something had already changed, not in a way that could be fixed or named, in a way that couldn't be undone. The day nothing ended was the day the story quietly began. What she keeps carrying. By the time she noticed the weight, she had already been carrying it for years. It didn't arrive all at once. It gathered slowly, piece by piece, the way small things do when they're never put down. A comment she swallowed, a plan she adjusted, a need she postponed. None of it felt significant enough to mark as a turning point. Each moment seemed reasonable on its own. Together, they became something else. She learned early how to be the one who made things easier. If someone else was tired, she took over. If someone else was uncertain, she decided for them. If something felt off, she smoothed it over before it could become visible. This wasn't something she questioned. It was simply how she moved through the world. Being attentive had always worked. It kept things calm. It kept people close. Over time, that attentiveness turned into a kind of constant readiness. She stayed alert to changes in tone, in mood, in timing. She could sense when a conversation was about to become uncomfortable and knew exactly how to redirect it. She could tell when someone was disappointed before they said a word and would quietly adjust her behavior to prevent it from settling in. This skill was rarely acknowledged, but it was relied upon. And being relied upon has a way of becoming an expectation. The strange part was that no one ever asked her to carry all of it. There was no meeting where the responsibilities were assigned, no agreement she signed. She simply stepped into the space where things needed holding, and once she was there, no one noticed the effort it took to remain steady. In the relationship, this showed up in subtle ways. She remembered birthdays. She kept track of family obligations. She adjusted her schedule to match his without making it obvious. When decisions needed to be made, she often deferred not because she didn't have an opinion, but because having one seemed to complicate things. It was easier to go along, easier to adapt, easier to stay agreeable. At first, this didn't feel like a loss. It felt like love. It felt like partnership. She told herself this was what it meant to build something with someone. You bend, you compromise, you show up even when it's inconvenient. That story made sense. It fit the life she was living. But bending without ever straightening has consequences. There were moments when she caught herself rehearsing explanations in her head for things she hadn't even done yet. If she needed time alone, she thought about how to justify it. If she wanted something different, she planned how to frame it so it wouldn't sound demanding. She filtered her own thoughts before they reached the surface, not out of fear, exactly, but out of habit. It was second nature by now. What she didn't notice at first was how much energy this took. How much of her day was spent monitoring, adjusting, anticipating. She moved through her life like someone carrying a tray that could never be tilted, careful not to spill anything, careful not to let her arms shake. From the outside, it looked like grace. From the inside, it was exhausting. Still, nothing was wrong enough to stop. That was the problem. If there had been a clear line, a moment when staying became obviously harmful, she might have trusted herself to react. But instead, there was only accumulation. One small concession layered on top of another. One quiet sacrifice added to the pile. The weight grew gradually, almost imperceptibly. She started to notice it in her body before she understood it in her mind. A tightness when she thought about the future. A heaviness when she imagined making plans that were truly her own. She found herself tired in a way that rest didn't fix. Not physically tired. Something else. Something deeper and harder to explain. When she tried to name it, the words didn't quite fit. She wasn't unhappy. She wasn't being mistreated. She wasn't trapped. Those labels felt too extreme. Her life looked good, stable, predictable. People would have called her lucky, and she knew that. She reminded herself of it often. Gratitude became another thing she carried. Whenever a thought arose that hinted at dissatisfaction, she countered it quickly. Others have it worse. This is what commitment looks like. Don't be ungrateful. She kept these phrases close, ready to deploy whenever the weight made itself known. They worked for a while. They pushed the discomfort back just far enough that she could keep going. But the discomfort didn't disappear. It waited. There were evenings when she sat alone, scrolling aimlessly, feeling a strange sense of distance from her own life. She would come across images of places she wanted to go, things she wanted to try, versions of herself she barely recognized anymore. She didn't feel envy exactly, more like a faint remembering, as if she were looking at something that used to belong to her. She rarely spoke about these moments. They felt too vague, too unjustified. How do you explain a weight that has no single source? How do you talk about the cost of being the one who always stays when no one has asked you to leave? In conversations with friends, she found herself defaulting to reassurance. Yes, things are good. We're fine, busy, but good. The words came easily. They had been practiced. They kept the questions at bay. They kept her from having to look too closely at what she was carrying. Sometimes late at night, she wondered what would happen if she stopped holding everything together. Not in a dramatic way. Just a small experiment. What if she didn't adjust? What if she let something be awkward? The thought made her uneasy. Not because of what others would do, but because of who she might become. She wasn't sure how to exist without that role. Being the steady one had shaped her sense of herself for so long that imagining life without it felt disorienting. Who would she be if she wasn't managing, anticipating, accommodating? Would she still be seen as loving, as reliable, as good? These questions didn't have answers. They floated at the edges of her awareness, surfacing when she was quiet, receding when the day demanded her attention again. And the day always demanded something. She noticed how quickly she stepped in when tension appeared, a disagreement between others, a silence that lingered too long. She filled the space without thinking. She offered solutions, compromises, explanations. She took responsibility for smoothing things over even when she wasn't involved. This reflex was so ingrained that it felt automatic. She didn't consider whether it was fair. She just did it. Over time, this constant adjustment began to blur the line between what she wanted and what was expected. The two overlapped so often that separating them required effort she wasn't sure how to make. When asked what she preferred, she sometimes froze, genuinely uncertain. The question felt unfamiliar, like a language she hadn't spoken in years. In the relationship, this showed up in decisions about the future. Where to go, what to prioritize, how to spend time. She went along with plans that made sense on paper, but left her feeling strangely absent. She told herself she would adapt, that she always did. She told herself this was normal, and yet the weight continued to grow. She began to recognize a pattern. Each time she chose to stay quiet instead of speaking, she felt a brief sense of relief. Crisis avoided, discomfort postponed. But afterward there was a residue, a lingering sense that something had been set aside again, that she had made herself smaller in a way that didn't quite resolve. She didn't resent him. Not exactly. Resentment felt too harsh, too accusatory. What she felt was more subtle. A quiet tally she didn't want to keep, a sense of imbalance she couldn't ignore. She was giving something she couldn't quite name, and she wasn't sure anyone noticed. The hardest part was that she couldn't point to a single moment when this began. There was no clear before and after, just a gradual shift, a slow redistribution of space. Her needs didn't disappear. They were simply deferred again and again until they became faint. On the outside, she was still functioning, still present, still kind. Inside, she was carrying a growing awareness that something about this arrangement was costing her more than she had expected. Not in a way that demanded immediate action, but in a way that made it harder to ignore with each passing day. She wondered how long a person could live like this, not in crisis, not in misery, but in quiet imbalance. How long she could keep caring without ever setting the weight down. How long she could tell herself that staying was the same as choosing when it no longer felt that way. She didn't know the answers. She only knew that the weight was real, even if it couldn't be seen, and that acknowledging it, even silently, had begun to change how she moved through her days. Nothing had ended yet, but something was beginning to press back. The cost no one asked about. There is a particular kind of cost that doesn't come with a receipt. No one points it out. No one thanks you for paying it. In fact, most people don't even realize it exists. It's the cost of being the one who adjusts first, the one who bends before anyone else has to, the one who notices what's needed and quietly supplies it without being asked. She had grown so used to paying that cost that it barely registered as a choice anymore. It was simply how things worked. If there was tension, she eased it. If there was uncertainty, she stabilized it. If there was discomfort, she absorbed it. This didn't come from a sense of obligation she could explain. It came from familiarity, from years of learning that this was how harmony was maintained. The problem with unspoken costs is that they accumulate without negotiation. In the relationship, there were countless small moments where this showed up. When plans were made, she adjusted her expectations before anyone else had to. When something mattered to her, she measured whether it was worth the potential disruption. Often she decided it wasn't. Not because it didn't matter, but because raising it would require a conversation she didn't feel equipped to have anymore. She told herself she was being considerate, that she was choosing peace, that these were reasonable trade-offs in any long-term partnership, and maybe they were. But there was a difference she hadn't fully acknowledged. Peace was being maintained, but at her expense, and no one had asked her to make that trade. That realization crept in slowly. It didn't arrive as anger or confrontation. It arrived as a quiet noticing, a sense that she was carrying responsibilities that had never been discussed, let alone shared. She was managing emotional logistics that no one else seemed aware of, keeping track of moods, timing conversations, anticipating reactions, making sure the atmosphere stayed workable. This labor was invisible even to her for a long time. She didn't think of it as work, she thought of it as care. But care, when it is consistently one-sided, begins to feel less like generosity and more like erosion. There were moments when she considered what it would look like to stop doing some of these things, to let a silence stretch, to allow disappointment to exist without rushing to soften it. The idea made her uneasy, not because she believed something terrible would happen, but because she had no model for what came next. She didn't know how to occupy space without managing it, so she continued. She paid the cost quietly. She reassured herself that this was normal, that relationships required effort, that no one got everything they wanted. These thoughts were familiar. They had served her well for a long time. They helped her make sense of situations that didn't quite sit right, but they also kept her from asking a simpler question. Why does this always seem to be mine to handle? She didn't ask it out loud. She barely asked it to herself. Instead, she noticed how often she felt a subtle resistance before agreeing to something. A pause she overrode quickly. She noticed how often she felt relief after canceling her own plans. Relief not because she wanted to, but because it removed the need to negotiate. Negotiation had begun to feel risky, not dangerous, just destabilizing. It introduced variables she didn't want to manage. It required her to assert something she wasn't sure she was allowed to claim anymore. The cost showed up in her body in ways she couldn't ignore forever. A tension that settled into her shoulders, a shallow quality to her rest, a sense of always being on even when nothing was happening. She found it difficult to relax fully, as if she were waiting for something that never arrived. When she imagined the future, she noticed how often she pictured herself adapting rather than choosing. She assumed she would make it work whatever it was. She assumed she would find a way to be okay. This assumption had carried her far. It had also quietly limited her sense of possibility. She wondered when she had stopped imagining herself as someone who could disrupt things, someone who could change the arrangement rather than adjust to it. The thought felt almost foreign. Disruption had become associated with selfishness in her mind, with being difficult, with creating problems where none existed. And yet the problems did exist. They just lived in places no one else was looking. There were conversations she replayed in her head, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Moments when she almost spoke, and then didn't. She could remember the exact point where she chose silence, not dramatically, casually, as if it were the obvious option. Each time this happened, she told herself it was a small thing, not worth addressing. And maybe it was. But small things repeated often enough begin to shape a life. She noticed how carefully she framed her needs when she did mention them. She softened her language. She minimized the impact. She made sure to acknowledge how reasonable it was if nothing changed. She did this instinctively, without resentment, without accusation. It was simply how she had learned to speak. What she didn't say was how much effort it took to keep presenting herself this way, how much energy went into making her desires palatable, how often she preemptively dismissed herself so no one else would have to. No one asked her to do this. That was the part she couldn't quite reconcile. She was paying a cost that no one had demanded. She was making sacrifices that were never discussed, and because they were unspoken, they couldn't be recognized. They couldn't be appreciated. They couldn't be shared. This left her in a strange position. She felt tired but couldn't explain why. She felt unsettled but couldn't point to a cause. When she tried to describe it, the words sounded thin, almost ungrateful. So she stopped trying. Instead, she told herself she was lucky. She reminded herself of all the ways things could be worse. She compared her situation to others and found reasons to stay quiet. These comparisons were convincing. They helped her keep going, but they didn't remove the cost. They just made it harder to name. There were moments when she caught a glimpse of what she had been giving up, a fleeting sense of herself before all the adjustments, a memory of speaking freely, of wanting something without immediately calculating its impact. These moments were brief, but they lingered longer than she expected. She didn't know what to do with them. They felt both familiar and distant, like hearing a song you used to know by heart and realizing you've forgotten most of the words. In the relationship, this showed up as a growing sense of distance that had nothing to do with intimacy. She could be physically close and still feel removed. She could be present and still feel like an observer of her own life. This dissonance was subtle but persistent. She began to understand that the cost she was paying wasn't just time or energy. It was presence. It was the gradual withdrawal from her own experience, the way she had learned to prioritize the maintenance of the relationship over her participation in it. This realization didn't lead to immediate action. It didn't inspire clarity. If anything, it made things more complicated. Because now she could see the cost, but she didn't know how to stop paying it without becoming someone she wasn't sure she was allowed to be. She wondered what would happen if she named it. Not even to him, just to herself. If she acknowledged that staying had a price and that the price was hers alone. The thought was unsettling. It suggested a level of responsibility she wasn't ready to take on. So she sat with it quietly. She continued her routines. She kept things running. But now, beneath the surface, there was a growing awareness that something fundamental was out of balance. Not dramatically, not urgently, but undeniably. The cost no one asked about had finally made itself known. And even if she didn't know what to do with that knowledge, yet she could no longer pretend it wasn't there. Nothing had been said. Nothing had changed. And yet the weight felt heavier than before, precisely because she could now feel where it came from. The story was still unfolding, and for the first time she suspected that staying might not be the same as choosing. Being the one who doesn't leave. She had become known for it, even if no one ever said it directly. She was the one who stayed, not stubbornly, not dramatically, quietly, consistently. When things became uncomfortable, she didn't threaten to walk away. When moments felt strained, she leaned in instead of stepping back. When doubts appeared, she handled them privately so they wouldn't disrupt what had already been built. There was a certain reputation that came with this. People trusted her. They felt safe around her. They assumed she wouldn't disappear when things got complicated. This assumption followed her everywhere, not just in her relationship. Friends leaned on her during transitions. Family counted on her to show up. She was seen as steady, dependable, emotionally mature. These were compliments she accepted without hesitation. What no one saw was how carefully she maintained that image. In the relationship, being the one who didn't leave shaped every interaction. Disagreements ended quickly often because she let them. She knew which topics would stretch things too far and learned to navigate around them. She picked her moments with precision, not because she lacked courage, but because she understood the cost of being perceived as disruptive. Leaving in her mind wasn't just an action, it was a statement. It said something about who you were, about your capacity to endure, about how much you valued what you had. She had absorbed these ideas over time through observation more than instruction. The people she admired stayed. The people who left were spoken about carefully as if their choice required explanation. So she became someone who didn't require explaining. There were moments when she noticed how this role shaped her sense of time. She thought in terms of longevity, of sticking it out, of making things work eventually. The future was something she imagined enduring rather than entering. This wasn't a conscious decision. It was simply the frame she used. When she thought about leaving, even hypothetically, her mind jumped immediately to the aftermath. The conversations, the disappointment, the questions she would have to answer. She could picture the looks on people's faces, the subtle shift in how she would be seen. She didn't imagine relief or freedom. She imagined responsibility. This anticipation alone was often enough to stop the thought in its tracks. Staying, by contrast, felt predictable. It allowed her to remain legible to others, to continue being understood. There was a comfort in that, even as it narrowed her options. She knew how to be the one who stayed, She had practiced it for years. What she hadn't practiced was listening to the part of herself that was growing restless. That restlessness didn't announce itself loudly. It showed up as distraction, as a tendency to drift during conversations, as a sense of watching herself respond instead of fully responding. She noticed how often she nodded along while something else moved underneath, unacknowledged. She wondered when she had learned to equate consistency with goodness, when reliability had become her primary offering. These traits had served her well. They had earned her trust and appreciation, but they had also boxed her into a version of herself that left little room for change. In the relationship, this meant that expectations solidified quietly. She was the one who would understand, the one who would adjust, the one who would stay. These expectations were never stated outright, which made them harder to challenge. They existed as assumptions reinforced over time. She didn't resent this. That surprised her. She had always thought resentment would be the signal that something was wrong. But what she felt was more subdued, a muted sense of displacement, like living in a house where the furniture had been rearranged without her noticing until one day she couldn't find where to sit. Being the one who didn't leave came with a certain moral weight. It placed her on the right side of things. It allowed her to see herself as committed, patient, generous. These were qualities she valued deeply. Letting go of them felt like a risk she wasn't sure how to take, and yet she began to notice how this role limited her ability to be honest, not in dramatic confessions or ultimatums, in small, everyday ways. She avoided saying when she was tired of adjusting. She softened her language when she wanted something to change. She kept her questions neutral, careful not to imply dissatisfaction. Over time, this caution became exhausting. It required constant self-monitoring. She had to stay aware not only of what she was feeling, but of how it might be received. This dual awareness left little space for spontaneity, little space for surprise. She noticed how rare it had become for her to act without first considering the consequences. Not because she was anxious, but because she was responsible. Responsibility had become her defining trait. It guided her decisions, shaped her reactions, and justified her staying. But responsibility, when carried alone, can quietly turn into isolation. There were moments when she wished someone would ask her directly if she was still okay with this, not in a confrontational way. Just a simple check-in, an acknowledgement that staying also requires consent. But that question never came, and she wasn't sure how to ask it herself. The truth was, she wasn't certain what her answer would be. Being the one who didn't leave had protected her from many things, from uncertainty, from judgment, from the chaos that can follow change. But it had also kept her in place long after the fit had begun to feel strained. She started to see that staying had become part of her identity. It wasn't just what she did, it was who she was understood to be. Changing that felt like more than a relationship decision. It felt like a redefinition of herself. That realization settled in slowly. It didn't demand action. It simply made itself known. She could see now how much of her sense of being good was tied to being consistent, how much of her value in her own eyes came from not leaving. And once she saw that she couldn't unsee it, she began to sense that the question she had been avoiding wasn't about the relationship at all. It was about who she was allowed to become if she stopped being the one who stayed. The answer wasn't clear. It didn't arrive with certainty or relief. It hovered unresolved, pressing gently against the edges of her days. She was still there, still present, still reliable. Nothing had changed on the surface, but underneath, something had shifted. The role she had worn so comfortably was beginning to feel heavier, not because it was wrong, but because it no longer fit as effortlessly as it once had. Being the one who didn't leave had shaped her life in countless ways. Now, for the first time, she was beginning to wonder what it might cost her to keep playing that role indefinitely. She didn't leave, not yet. But staying was no longer silent. When good starts to change shape. For most of her life, being good had felt clear. It meant being thoughtful, being dependable, being the person others didn't have to worry about. It meant knowing when to step in and when to step back. It meant choosing the option that kept things intact, even if it wasn't the one she wanted most. She had lived inside that definition for so long that she rarely questioned it. Being good had brought her approval, stability, belonging. It had given her a place in the lives of others. It had made her valuable in ways that were visible and rewarded. But lately, that definition had begun to feel unstable. It wasn't that she suddenly wanted to be reckless or unkind. Nothing like that. What unsettled her was the way being good had started to require more and more of her while offering less in return. The balance had shifted quietly without announcement. What once felt like generosity now felt like obligation. What once felt chosen now felt expected. She noticed this most clearly in moments where she almost spoke and then stopped. There were times she wanted to say, "This isn't working for me anymore," but the words felt too heavy, too final. Other times she wanted to say, "I need something different," but even that felt like too much. So she defaulted to the language she knew. "It's fine. We'll figure it out. It's not a big deal." Each time she said these things, she felt a small internal correction, as if she were adjusting herself back into alignment with an older version of what goodness required. But that older version was beginning to fail her. She began to see how often being good meant being quiet, how often it meant absorbing discomfort rather than naming it, how often it meant prioritizing the smooth continuation of things over her own participation in them. These realizations didn't arrive as accusations. They arrived as observations, calm and persistent. She paid attention to how she reacted when other women chose differently, when someone set a boundary, when someone left, when someone disrupted expectations. Part of her admired it. Another part of her felt uneasy, as if witnessing a rule being broken that she herself was still bound by. She wondered when goodness had become so tightly linked to endurance. In the relationship, this shift showed up as a growing disconnect between what she did and what she felt. She continued to show up to care, to be present, but the meaning she once attached to those actions had changed. They no longer felt like expressions of love. They felt like maintenance. Maintenance kept things from falling apart. It didn't bring them to life. This distinction lingered with her. She found herself questioning not whether she was being good enough, but whether goodness, as she understood it, was asking her to disappear in ways she could no longer ignore. The question wasn't dramatic. It didn't demand an immediate answer. It simply refused to go away. She noticed how careful she had become with her own dissatisfaction. She treated it like something fragile, something that needed to be handled gently so it wouldn't upset the balance. She didn't allow it to take up much space. She didn't give it a voice. She kept it contained. But containment has a limit. There were moments when she felt a flicker of irritation at herself. Not for staying, but for how automatically she stayed. How quickly she dismissed her own hesitation. How reflexively she returned to the role of the reasonable one. That irritation surprised her. She wasn't used to turning her attention inward like that. She began to suspect that being good as she had practiced it required a constant turning away from certain truths. Not big truths, small ones, everyday ones, like "I'm tired of adjusting," or "I don't want this anymore," or "I need more space than this allows." These truths didn't make her a bad person, but they didn't fit neatly into the version of goodness she had learned to uphold. This realization unsettled her more than she expected. If being good no longer aligned with being honest, then what was she supposed to prioritize? The question felt dangerous, not because it suggested wrongdoing, but because it threatened a core organizing principle of her life. Goodness had been her compass. It had told her how to behave, how to choose, how to stay connected. Without it, she wasn't sure how to navigate. She wasn't sure what rules applied anymore. She noticed how often she measured her choices by how they would be perceived. Would this make me seem selfish? Would this disappoint someone? Would this change how I'm seen? These considerations had always guided her. Now they felt insufficient. There were moments when she imagined choosing differently, saying no, stepping back, not explaining herself. These images didn't bring relief. They brought unease. They felt unfamiliar, like trying on a coat that didn't quite belong to her yet. She wasn't ready to act on these thoughts. She didn't even fully trust them. But she couldn't dismiss them either. They had a weight to them, a persistence that suggested they weren't going anywhere. Being good had once felt like a solid ground beneath her feet. Now it felt like something that was slowly shifting, changing shape beneath her without her consent. She was still standing on it, but she no longer trusted it to hold her in the same way. In the relationship, this created a subtle tension, not between them, but within her. She found herself less certain, less automatic. She hesitated more. She noticed more. She felt the strain between what was expected of her and what she could realistically continue to give. This strain didn't result in conflict. It resulted in quiet, a deeper, more attentive quiet than before. She listened to herself in ways she hadn't allowed herself to before. She noticed what tightened and what softened. She paid attention to the moments when staying felt like an act of care and the moments when it felt like erasure. These distinctions mattered even if she didn't know what to do with them yet. She realized that goodness, if it was to mean anything at all, might have to include her. Not just her role, not just her reliability, but her presence, her limits, her voice. This thought lingered unresolved and unsettling. It didn't offer clarity or direction. It simply marked a shift, a recognition that the old definition no longer fit, and that continuing to live by it would require increasing levels of self-denial. She was still being good by all outward measures. She was still kind, still committed, still there. But inside, something had changed. The meaning of goodness was no longer stable. It was beginning to fracture, not dramatically, but decisively. She didn't know what would replace it. She didn't know if anything would. She only knew that being good could no longer mean the same thing it once did, and that this realization had quietly altered the ground she was standing on. The story was moving forward even if nothing on the surface seemed different. And with each passing day, the question became harder to ignore. What if being good was no longer enough? The silence that holds everything together. Silence had always felt like something she controlled. It was a choice, a tool she used carefully. She knew when to speak and when to hold back. She knew how to let a moment pass without filling it. This restraint had served her well. It kept conversation smooth. It kept misunderstandings from forming. It kept the atmosphere manageable. Over time, silence became the space where everything stayed intact. In the relationship, she noticed how much depended on what she didn't say. There were pauses she extended deliberately, questions she rephrased until they lost their edge, reactions she softened before they reached the surface. She did this without thinking, the way you instinctively steady something fragile before it falls. She told herself this was maturity, that not everything needed to be said, that timing mattered. That restraint was a form of care. These ideas weren't wrong. They were just incomplete. The silence she maintained wasn't empty. It was full of adjustments. It held all the things she filtered out, the moments she swallowed, the words she edited, the reactions she chose not to have. From the outside, it looked like calm. From the inside, it felt like constant calculation. She became aware of how quickly she scanned conversations for risk. Not danger, just disruption. She could sense when a comment might lead somewhere uncomfortable and would subtly redirect before it got there. She had learned how to do this so smoothly that it often went unnoticed even by her. But unnoticed doesn't mean unfelt. There were times she sat across from him, listening, nodding, responding appropriately while a parallel conversation played out inside her. A quieter one that noticed the gap between what was happening and what she wanted to say. That gap wasn't dramatic. It didn't ache. It simply existed, steady and unresolved. Silence, she realized, was doing a lot of work. It protected the relationship from friction. It protected her from having to articulate dissatisfaction she wasn't sure how to justify. It protected her image as someone easy to be with, someone reasonable, someone who didn't create problems. At the same time, it isolated her. She noticed how rarely she spoke without first considering how it would land. How often she adjusted her tone to sound neutral even when something mattered to her. How frequently she chose the version of herself that would be easiest to receive. This wasn't deception. It was adaptation, and it had become automatic. She began to wonder when silence had shifted from being a choice to being a requirement. There were moments when she imagined breaking it, not with accusations or ultimatums, just with honesty, saying something simple and true without cushioning it. The idea felt heavier than she expected, not because she feared his reaction, but because she feared her own. She wasn't sure what would come out once the silence was no longer holding everything together. Silence had given her a sense of control. It allowed her to manage outcomes, to keep things predictable, to avoid scenes she didn't know how to navigate. Letting go of it meant stepping into uncertainty she wasn't prepared for, so she stayed quiet. The cost of that quiet showed up gradually. She felt less present in conversations, less engaged. She caught herself agreeing out of habit rather than conviction. She noticed how often she felt relieved when discussions ended, not because they were difficult, but because they required her to stay alert. She didn't think of this as hiding. That word felt too strong. She thought of it as being careful, being considerate, being thoughtful. These qualities had always been associated with goodness in her mind, but now she began to see how silence was shaping her life in ways she hadn't intended. It allowed assumptions to solidify, expectations to form without discussion, roles to become fixed. By not speaking, she gave quiet consent to arrangements that no longer worked for her. She didn't mean to. She simply didn't interrupt them. She noticed how often she felt a subtle urge to withdraw after long stretches of silence. Not physically, but internally, a pulling back of attention. A slight distance that made it easier to continue without fully engaging. This withdrawal wasn't planned. It was a response. Silence, she realized, doesn't just keep things together. It also keeps things from evolving. There were moments when she wondered what would happen if she stopped maintaining it, if she allowed a pause to remain awkward, if she let a question hang unanswered. These thoughts didn't bring clarity. They brought a sense of risk she wasn't sure how to tolerate. She had learned that silence was safer than uncertainty, that keeping things stable was preferable to opening something she might not be able to close. This belief had guided her for a long time. It had also kept her contained. She began to see how much of her sense of responsibility was tied to this silence. If she spoke and things changed, she would feel accountable. If she stayed quiet and things stayed the same, she could tell herself she hadn't caused harm. Silence allowed her to remain blameless, but it also left her unseen. This realization didn't push her toward action. It didn't inspire confrontation. It simply altered how she experienced her own quiet. Silence was no longer neutral. It carried weight. It had consequences. She noticed how often she chose silence not because she had nothing to say, but because she didn't want to disrupt the version of herself others had come to expect. Speaking would require her to step out of that version, to risk being misunderstood, to risk being seen differently. And being seen differently felt like a bigger change than she was ready to make. So the silence remained. It continued to hold everything together, the routines, the relationship, the image, the peace. It did its job well, but now she could feel its edges. She could sense where it pressed against her. She could tell that it was holding more than it should have to, that it was carrying a burden it wasn't designed to bear. She didn't break it. Not yet. She only noticed it. And in noticing it, something shifted. The silence was no longer invisible. It had become part of the story, not as an absence, but as a presence that shaped everything around it. Nothing had been said. Nothing had changed. But the quiet was heavier now, and she was beginning to understand why. The question she had been circling moved closer, not demanding an answer, just making itself felt. How long can silence hold before it starts holding her back? The question that doesn't go away. By now, the question no longer surprised her. It didn't arrive suddenly or forcefully. It was simply there, waiting in the background of her days, patient and unyielding. It showed up when she was doing ordinary things, washing dishes, driving familiar roads, folding clothes that belonged to a life she knew well. The question didn't interrupt. It accompanied. She had learned how to live alongside it. The question wasn't framed as an ultimatum. It didn't ask her to decide anything. It didn't push her toward action. It only asked for acknowledgement. It asked her to notice the gap between staying because she wanted to and staying because she didn't know how to leave without becoming someone else entirely. She realized that this question had been forming long before she allowed herself to hear it. It had taken shape through all the moments she adjusted without being asked, through every time she chose quiet over clarity, through each small compromise that felt reasonable on its own but costly in accumulation. Now that it was fully formed, it refused to be ignored. She noticed how often she answered other people's needs without hesitation, while her own remained suspended, waiting for a time that never quite arrived. She noticed how much of her energy went into maintaining continuity, keeping things as they were, making sure nothing broke. This effort had become so habitual that she barely recognized it as effort anymore. But the question did. It asked her to consider whether continuity was the same as connection, whether stability was the same as presence, whether being good had quietly replaced being real. She didn't rush to respond. Rushing had never been her way. She observed instead. She paid attention to how the question felt when she let it linger. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't urgent, it was steady, persistent. like something that had earned the right to be there. She began to see how much of her life had been organized around avoiding this moment, not consciously, but through patterns that kept her occupied, busy, needed. There was always something to manage, something to attend to, something that required her focus. The question waited until things slowed down, until she had no immediate task to hide behind. In those quieter moments, she felt the full weight of it. The question didn't accuse her of anything. It didn't tell her she had been wrong. It didn't diminish the care she had given or the effort she had made. It simply asked whether the version of herself who had learned to stay was still the one she wanted to live as. That was harder to answer than she expected. She had spent so long being shaped by what others needed from her that her own desires felt indistinct. Not absent, just faint. Like a sound she could hear only when everything else went quiet, and even then she wasn't sure what it was saying. She noticed how often she thought about leaving in abstract terms, not a specific plan, just the idea of not being here in this role forever. That idea carried a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief at the possibility of something else. Guilt at the thought of disrupting what existed. The question sat between those two responses, refusing to resolve them. She realized that part of what made it so persistent was that it wasn't asking her to choose between him and herself. That framing felt too simple, too dramatic. The real tension was quieter. It was about whether she could remain who she was becoming, while continuing to be who she had been. Those two selves no longer fit together easily. She began to understand that the question wasn't something she would answer once and be done with. It wasn't a problem to solve. It was a marker. A sign that something essential had shifted, even if the outer shape of her life remained the same. This understanding didn't bring clarity. It brought presence. She found herself moving through her days with a different kind of attention, not hypervigilant, just aware. She noticed when she agreed out of habit, when she stayed quiet out of reflex, when she felt the familiar pull to smooth things over. These patterns were still there, but now she could see them. Seeing them didn't make them disappear. It made them conscious, and consciousness has weight. She understood now that the question would remain with her as long as she continued to live in a way that required her to leave parts of herself unacknowledged. It wasn't punishing her. It was simply refusing to let her forget. There was something grounding about that. She didn't need to know what came next. She didn't need a plan. She didn't need certainty. The question wasn't asking for any of that. It was only asking her not to turn away anymore, not to silence it, not to cover it with gratitude or responsibility or goodness, just to let it exist. This was new for her, letting something unresolved remain present without immediately managing it, without trying to fix it, without rushing to conclusions. It felt uncomfortable. It also felt honest. She noticed how this quiet honesty changed the way she held herself. She stood differently, listened differently, responded with a slight pause she hadn't allowed herself before. These changes were subtle, barely noticeable to anyone else, but they mattered to her. The question didn't demand that she leave. It didn't demand that she stay. It only demanded that she stop pretending the cost didn't exist, and that demand quiet as it was carried authority. She was still there, still in the relationship, still performing the roles she had learned so well, but she was no longer fully merged with them. There was a separation now, a small but significant distance between what she did and who she was. That distance gave her room to breathe. The question continued to follow her not as a threat but as a companion. It reminded her that staying was no longer something she could do unconsciously, that whatever she chose moving forward would require her presence. She didn't know yet what she would do with that awareness. She only knew that it was hers now. It belonged to her in a way nothing else had for a long time, and that knowing, even without action, changed the texture of her life. The question didn't go away, but neither did she. There are stories that end with decisions and stories that end with declarations. This isn't one of those stories. This is the kind that settles into you quietly and stays. Nothing has been resolved here. She hasn't left. She hasn't announced anything. The world around her looks much the same. The routines continue. The roles remain. On the surface, nothing has shifted enough to be named, but underneath something has taken root. She is no longer moving through her life on automatic. She is no longer confusing endurance with devotion without noticing the cost. She is no longer unaware of how much of herself has been required to keep everything as it is. This awareness doesn't make her strong in the way strength is often portrayed. It doesn't make her certain. It doesn't give her answers. What it gives her is presence. A sense of being inside her own experience rather than performing it from the outside. She hasn't rejected the part of herself that stayed. She understands it now. She sees why it existed, why it was necessary, why it made sense. That part carried her through many years. It kept things together when they might have fallen apart. She doesn't turn against it. She simply no longer lets it speak for her alone. There is a quiet authority in this shift, not loud, not visible, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself to be real. It lives in the way she pauses before agreeing, in the way she listens inwardly before responding, in the way she allows the question to remain without rushing to silence it. Her life has not changed yet, but her relationship to it has, and that change, subtle as it is, cannot be undone. She remains where she is, but she is no longer absent from herself. She occupies her own experience with a steadiness she hasn't felt in a long time. Not certainty, not confidence, just presence. The story doesn't close here. It lingers. It leaves space. It trusts that what has been noticed cannot be unseen. She stays with the question, and for the first time, she stays with herself.